Hi, this is Stephanie Stock with Ohio Advocates for Medical Freedom. I'm here today. We have Alan Phillips joining us. He is a North Carolina lawyer that is focused his practice solely on vaccine exemptions and legislative action. Today we're going to break down HB559, talk about a little bit about what the legislators say it says, and then also what the law actually states in black and white. So first, just kind of want to go over what the issues with the bill are. So this bill would require a state form from the health department. It would require a vaccine education for parents of K 7th through 12th grades. There will be a doctor's, it says that you'll have to see a physician or some other healthcare professional to basically get a vaccine education before they would sign your form. And then also there will be a tracking component to the bill, so that they will track the vaccination rates. They said they will not track the individual names of the children, but for each district and school, they will have a record of which, how many are unvaccinated. So they will have that for the health department and each state district, and they will be posted on a website. So first, why don't we just break for a second to go to the actual hearing to see what the legislators are saying about the bill.
It requires that a physician, nurse practitioner, physician assistant, pharmacist, or RN working in a health department to sign the form for all required immunizations for school entry into kindergarten, grades 7 and 12, or a student who transfers from another state. And it's on a side note, it's already stated that the Ohio Association of School Nurses would like an amendment to address interstate cross-district student transfers, so they'll be coming to you in the future. This process is already used for state licensed child care centers, and the signature verifies merely that the information contained on the form is medically accurate. And I have a copy of the form. We'll make sure that all members receive a copy of the example of what it could look like.
Okay, so as far as the state health form goes, it's, as you know, by our state law, we currently have just a general statement by the parent or guardian, saying that they want to decline for reasons of conscience or religious reasons. So of course we're concerned, what is this form going to say? Who's writing the form? Will it violate freedom of speech? And maybe you can kind of talk to us a little bit about required speech, and if these forms, might incriminate a parent as being like a threat to the community or a threat to their child's health. If you wouldn't mind touching on kind of the required speech component of the bill, that'd be great.
The general disclaimer, nothing I'm saying today is intended to be legal advice on really on any matter. I'm just talking about educational concerns and questions, but in particular anything that would be a state law matter. Since I'm licensed in North Carolina, I do work with clients around the country, but when state law issues come up, I work with clients and a local attorney, because I can, as a general proposition, I can advise people about federal law anywhere in the country, but state law, you have to have the appropriate state license or work with an attorney that has the appropriate state license. So anything, the comments I'm making today are not intended to be formal legal advice for anyone, but really just general educational discussion points. There are 2 or 3 issues that come up, if not more, when you talk about requiring parents to get a vaccine education, as you say, and when they're required to sign a form. And it can depend, with regard to the form itself, the free speech component, it depends on what's in the form. But what's common in a lot of exemption forms in different contexts, school and other areas, is that they'll put out a bunch of quote-unquote facts, and the way the wording in the form is written, that a parent or other person signing the form, I see this come up in employment and other issues as well, they're being required many times to agree with a set of facts that, frankly, they disagree with. And the odds of a health department in today's world creating wording in a form where they're going to go beyond just asking you for basic information, what's your name and address, check this box, what are you objecting, on, religion or philosophical objections or what have you. If they go beyond and spout the sort of CDC party line, you understand that you're being, and of course I'm paraphrasing and being a little sarcastic here, but language to the effect is common in many forms that effectively says you agree you're being a bad person for signing this form and for getting an exemption. like they're trying to guilt you into changing your mind at the last minute and just getting with the program and go on and get the vaccines. If they do that, and you have to look carefully at the wording. There's a difference between saying, in effect, you agree with our set of facts, or you see what we believe. If the language of a form puts out information that you disagree with, and if the form requires you in signing the form to agree with their views, then they're crossing a constitutional line, very likely violating free speech. And it's sort of interesting how this works. Free speech is not only the right to have and speak your views, but it's also the right to be free from being compelled to speak. And if someone, or in particular government, is requiring you to agree with their view on something, then they are, for legal purposes, compelling or requiring you to speak. And that would violate free speech if they do that. So we have to see exactly what the form says, but it's an issue that I see that comes up commonly and frequently in exemption forms.
Yeah, we definitely see that here in different schools where they kind of just come up with their own form. And there's some pretty incriminating stuff on a lot of these forms. And parents are very concerned. A lot of times they consult us, should I be signing this? What should I do? So we definitely see that here. As far as the vaccine education goes, as far as it looks to us in the bill, in black and white, it does not say anything about the forms being able to be signed from afar. According to the hearing, the legislators, the sponsors of the bill, were saying, you know, hey, this is really easy. Your doctor can just fill this form out and they can just fax it to the school. There's no visit required. Of course, this doesn't make any sense because I can't think of a physician that's going to sign off on a medical education that they didn't actually physically give. So that in itself is a little bit hard to believe. But there's definitely nothing in the bill that states that that's an option. I'd like to break for just a second for us to review the footage from the hearing where they are discussing a little bit about the vaccine education portion of the bill.
Processing of the form can be handled via email or fax if a parent is not able to visit a provider. Doctors and other providers will not pressure parents about immunization and cannot refuse to sign the form. They will discuss the risks and benefits of immunization and not immunization, and then sign the form. Parents' rights are maintained in this bill. Conversations with a health care provider are essential to ensure that parents have all the appropriate medical and scientific information before making health care decisions, such as immunizing their child. States that have standardized their process have seen a 35% decrease in opt-outs of vaccines in just 1 year.
So as far as it looks to us, it definitely looks like there is a mandate of a doctor's visit since it doesn't state otherwise in the bill. Of course, we have the concern about undue financial hardship, you know, parents that maybe otherwise wouldn't go to a standard physician, maybe he's a chiropractor, maybe they don't go to a doctor for religious reasons like Christian Scientists or various groups like that, where it would be even against their religion to see a physician. That's one of our concerns. And then according to our Ohio Constitution, it does say in section I-21, no federal, state, or local law or rule shall compel directly or indirectly any person, employer, or healthcare provider to participate in a healthcare system. And like I said, the legislators were claiming that no visit was required, as we saw in the footage. And they're also claiming that there's no there's no way that the physician or healthcare provider can bully or coerce the parent. I think we know how that's going to go. Again, none of this is in the bill. So I'd just like to get your thoughts a little bit on, I guess, first a mandated doctor visit and how that would affect the religious portion, you know, the religious freedoms requiring something like that.
Well, first, this is one of those things that just doesn't pass the sniff test. I mean, just thinking in common sense terms, what does a doctor visit have to do with religious objections or even philosophical objections for that matter? The whole point of having those categories of exemptions separate from a medical exemption is because they deal with non-medical issues. But religion in particular, I find it just on a personal level highly offensive, the suggestion that to get a religious exemption, you should have to go get a medical education. That just feels to me like the state is stepping in or putting doctors in the position of between you and God. I mean, the only reason to get an education really is to try to talk you out of the exemption.
Right.
And if you have already made up your mind, you're already clear that you have religious objections, then that's the state using doctors to put you at odds with your own faith or your own religious beliefs, your own conscience. And so just to get on the common sense level, I personally find that unconscionable. But it also raises some serious constitutional questions. We have both a federal constitutional right to parent our children that includes making medical decisions. And if you have religious objections, then you have a separate First Amendment free exercise of religion constitutional right. And the combination of those rights creates a very high standard for states to, a high bar, if you will, for states to get over to be able to pass a law and have it hold up to constitutional scrutiny if this bill were to do these things and get passed into law, and then if somebody were to go into court challenging the constitutionality, they'd have a very strong case if that were to happen. And that's why I think it can be very helpful to have some sort of a written legal argument, even hopefully something brief, but something that you can take to legislators and say, hey, there are some constitutional issues that this bill raises. It's not a slam dunk win because you do that, but it's another persuasive tool to add with anything else you have that raises questions or concerns or that supports your objection to the bill.
Right, and maybe you can kind of elaborate on, being like a third requirement to the religious exemption, like let people know what the current requirements are versus adding the third requirement of a physician's signature education.
Yeah, thank you. I don't see a problem with states using a form to process exemptions, but there are things you can do with forms that raise constitutional questions and other things that wouldn't. If it's a purely procedural kind of thing, getting information about the applicant, the exemption applicant, for example, no problem with that. But we know, because of the way that federal courts have interpreted the First Amendment free exercise of religion as it concerns vaccine religious exemptions specifically, that there are only two requirements. And what we're really talking about here is, what does it take for a belief opposed to vaccines to have the protection of the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, protection from that so-called free exercise clause referring to the free exercise of religion? And the federal courts have said, well, there's only two things that are required. Now, these are very general phrases, and a complete explanation is beyond the scope of this interview. But as a starting point, if you have beliefs that are what the law calls religious in nature, and doesn't matter whether you belong to an organized religion, doesn't matter which one if you do, religious in nature and sincerely held. If you have beliefs that meet those two requirements, again, as the law defines those terms, then your beliefs are protected religious beliefs, or they qualify for a vaccine religious exemption. Now, federal law is a higher legal authority than state law, so states cannot add additional requirements. And by requiring somebody to get a vaccine education, to me, that is what the law would call a substantive or third requirement. But states don't have the authority to, in effect, rewrite the Constitution, to overrule the federal courts, so to speak. So when they add this third requirement, or what I see as a third requirement to the two constitutional requirements for vaccine religious exemption, they're overstepping legal boundaries. Now, there are 3 or 4 states that have already done this. They've passed laws requiring, in one way or another, a vaccine education. So there's some precedent in terms of other states doing this. And it's a very disturbing trend to me. I really would like to see people more aggressively or more effectively presenting these issues before bills get passed, so that legislators see there is a genuine issue here. But now that it's already happened in other states, it's easy for them to say, well, other states have done it, and it's worked out okay as far as we know.
Wrong too, so just follow them.
Yeah, they all jumped off the bridge, we should jump off the bridge too, so, but it's a is, I think, a serious constitutional question, and one that I think other states where this has happened, that people need to go back to their legislators and raise the issue, get them to amend that, take it out, or if necessary, jump through the hoops you need to jump to get it in front of a judge. Let's have a lawsuit if we can put that together. But one way or another, we need to address this issue, because this arena, vaccine state laws, exemption laws, states do look at one another to see what's going on in other parts of the country, and they're not necessarily making final decisions because some other state did something. But if 2 or 3 or 4 other states have done something, that's really strong support for the idea that it must be okay for us to do it too. So we've got to collectively, obviously a lot of what goes on in the vaccine issue in terms of laws happens at the state level, and every state can independently do what they want to do, and it might be the same or different from every other state. But states do pay attention to each other on this issue, other issues as well, I'm sure too. There is some influence. So we got to try to nip this one in the bud here if we can, because if we can get a state to reject this, a state legislature to reject this piece based on concerns of constitutionality or anything else that works, then maybe we can sort of stop this trend before it sweeps the rest of the nation.
Yeah, we definitely don't want it taking Ohio. That would not be a good thing. And I will say this, our Ohio Constitution in section I.07, it does point out, nor shall any interference with the rights of conscience be permitted. I would say a vaccine education is a pretty big interference with reasons of conscience or rights of conscience. So even our own Constitution, which I don't know, maybe some of our legislators need to pick that up again and peruse through it. We should have some protection even under our own state law. So that's unfortunate that that's not something that they're thinking about as they're looking at this as well. And I know you kind of touched on the issue with parents and the form making them look unfit. I know that falls under the 14th Amendment. I thought maybe you might just touch on that a little bit more as far as violating their constitutional right to parent their children. Maybe you can reference a couple of the Supreme Court rulings or something like that to kind of fill parents in a bit more on that part.
Sure. Well, first of all, the constitutional right to parent our children is not spelled out in the Constitution itself. It comes from a series of U.S. Supreme Court cases over approximately the last century or so. And what we know from the U.S. Supreme Court is that parents have the right to the care, custody, and control of their children. It's not an absolute right, but it's a very powerful right. It also comes with obligations, being a good parent. But the sort of bottom line here is that the constitutional right to parent our children comes from and through the 14th Amendment due process clause. And the concept here is real similar to the idea of innocent until proven guilty in the criminal system, criminal justice system. This not being a criminal issue, though, when we're talking about parenting our children. I mean, criminal issues can arise in parenting, but we're talking here about civil law, but it's a similar idea. And the idea is that we are presumed as parents to make decisions and take actions that are in our children's best interests. We are presumed to be good parents unless and until there's some kind of evidence to the contrary. And this is a case-by-case basis. That is, if there's evidence that any given parent is unfit, is not doing, is violating their obligation to their children at a level of severity that it would be called violating law. And usually they're going to call that abuse or neglect. You're either doing something proactively that's harmful, or you're failing to provide your child with something they need: food, medical care, warm house in the winter, or what have you. So by either overt action, which would be abuse, or failure to act, some form of neglect, those are usually the broad general categories. But until there's evidence showing that we're unfit, we're presumed to be fit. So when everybody who wants an exemption at one sweep because of a law, assuming this bill were to pass into law and require the vaccine education, to me that's in effect saying that all of these parents are not fit to make this decision and they must first be educated to become fit. Now, it may not be quite as black and white as it first sounds, because, for example, we all have to take driving tests before we can go out on the road and drive. We can think about this distinctions here between those two examples. But the point being that to assume that somebody as a parent is unfit without any evidence on a case-by-case basis, and if there was some connection, in other words, if we weren't talking about a religious or philosophical exemption and yet a medical education, if it wouldn't make sense that people would have to get a religious education because the free exercise of religion protects all sincerely held religious beliefs. And of course, many people share conflicting beliefs, but they're all still protected. So it just seems all the crazier. I'm sort of overlapping with an earlier comment, but it just seems all the crazier to me that you're unfit to make a decision that you have religious objections to vaccines unless you first get a medical education. Right. But the same thing can be true of some philosophical objections as well, not philosophical objections. Let's just one quick example. The one thing we know with a high level of certainty about vaccine adverse events is that we really have no idea what the true scope of vaccine injury and death is. Our own Federal Department of Health and Human Services just a few years ago said that over 99% of vaccine adverse events are never reported.
Right.
So does that mean there's 100 times more than what's reported, or 1,000 times more than what's reported? We have no idea. And so on a purely sort of philosophical grounds, well, I'm not sure which is worse, the risk from the disease or the worst of the vaccines. I personally am quite convinced the vaccines are far greater risk, but someone could reasonably have that question and say, I don't have the data, I can't really make a comparison. So they just have to sort of make more of a philosophical decision here. Well, it's philosophically, well, I don't know. There's a lot of different reasons that could be deemed philosophical reasons that are not going to be medical. They're not going to be clearly or truly religious. Again, neither one of those, religious or philosophical, necessarily is going, well, religious by definition in terms of the way the law sees religion, but philosophical might or might not have some overlap with medical concerns. So to require that, to presume, in effect, that somebody is not qualified to make a non-medical decision because they don't have medical information, just doesn't make, again, it doesn't pass the sniff test. It doesn't make sense on a common sense level, but it also raises a serious constitutional question because we're presumed to act in our children's best interest until there's information to the contrary. And if they're trying to say that by definition, if you want an exemption, then you're not fit to make the decision unless you get, medical information. Well, that's sort of a contradiction in terms. Either give me the exemption or don't give me the exemption. Give me the option or don't give it to me. Don't give it to me. And then when I reach my hand out to accept it from me, slap me on the hand. To accept it from you, slap me on the hand. Here, you can have it. Thank you. Whack. Wait a minute. Do I get it or not?
Right. And it's super frustrating as a parent. When you go into the doctor's office to quote unquote get your medical education and the physician can't name you 3 ingredients and you can name all the ingredients, you can tell them about the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, you can basically give that physician an education on vaccines more than they can give you, and yet you're the one that's being required to sit in. So that in itself is extremely frustrating. Most parents that are reading this bill are just pulling their hair out, saying, I'd like to give the doctor what for in my visit and give him a little bit of an education. And here you're requiring me to pay for a doctor's visit to go in and then be schooled by a physician on something that, unfortunately, it seems that for the most part, they do not know a lot about. So it's hugely frustrating in addition to being a violation of assortment of things in the Constitution. We can move on now to the tracking portion of the bill. So I'm going to go ahead and just take a look at the footage from the hearing on what the legislators had to say about the tracking portion.
Secondly, House Bill 559 streamlines how data regarding immunizations is handled and reported so public health officials, parents of immunocompromised children and other stakeholders would know the opt-out percentage rate at each school building.
Now, Alan, we're obviously very concerned. I know they say they're not going to mention any names of the children, but in some smaller school districts, or parents talk as soon as they find out. Oh, we can find out how many people are exempt. Oh, there's 3%. Who are the 3%? Honey, go to school and ask Jimmy and Jane. Do they get shots? I mean, eventually this stuff's going to come out, because the parents that want to know are going to poke around until they find out whether it's asking the other moms or what have you. Do you think this kind of thing is going to lead to discrimination against families that are just exercising their right to, an exemption? Because we're very, very concerned that it's going to turn into some sort of witch hunt for these parents. And because they're kind of spinning this as, oh, it's a right for the parents of immune compromised children to know what the rates are. So kind of curious what your thoughts on that, if you foresee that as being a potential issue, like discrimination in the school.
If you'll allow me, or maybe I can say forgive me, I'm going to, because I think there's a tie in here, but I want to jump back real quick to the education issue, just to make another point.
Okay.
If we insisted that the so-called vaccine education include what we would consider a balanced view, that it would mention the vaccine ingredients, it would mention the injury compensation program, it would mention the federal government's own assertion that 99% of the serious adverse events never even get reported, then of course they would dispense with the whole education issue altogether. If it had to be balanced, they'd withdraw, because a balanced education, a truly balanced education, is not going to achieve their goal. So here's the point. What's driving all of this, and the way the politics plays to try and get something passed, to try to get you to believe the bill does something that it doesn't do so they can get what they really want, for example. Hopefully we have a chance to talk about that more. But they want to collect this information. What can they do with that? Well, on one level, they can see whether or not there are outbreaks that seem to be associated, geographically with areas that have higher exemption rates or not. That's a potentially useful piece of information. But there are some political agendas that can be going on here as well. We're going to identify the schools, the areas, the districts that have higher exemption rates. And so we're going to target them in any way we can to try to put pressure on parents who aren't vaccinating to change their mind and vaccinate. And there are going to be situations where, whether they've released names or not, and this is what you were hinting at, Stephanie, that where it's going to come out. Yeah. And I just feel like, if they need the raw data of, this district has this many fully vaccinated, this many medical exemptions, this many religious, this many philosophical, whatever, that's interesting and potentially useful data. But if they're going to not have strict controls over what happens with that information, or perhaps even how they should collect it, or what can be done with it, and even if they have strict controls now, what are they going to do later? I mean, for example, look at the fact that 50 years ago, what did we have? 3 or 4 vaccines, maybe 3 or 4 injections, and 6, 8, or 10 different antigens, and now we're up to upwards of 70, different vaccines and so forth. They gradually built this up over time. This is a really important point to understand, that what's going on here is just a continuation of what has already been going on for decades. So any step they take that as a step in and of itself, looked at in isolation, looks benign or minimal or small, is not the whole story. Whatever advancement they make in the direction of serving the pharmaceutical agenda, which means more people being vaccinated with more vaccines and fewer people having a right to exempt or exercising exemptions if they still have the right. Anything that moves in that direction, you have to look at it in context. It's just the next baby step of a huge series of small steps that taken together have been monumental leaps. And look where we are. We're at a place where 99% of the harm, of serious harm, people being killed and disabled, is not even being reported. We don't even have any information about that. if even 10% of what was going on was actually reported, the injury compensation program would go bankrupt.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, only one of the reasons why that information continues to be suppressed is because the system can't support it. So, you know, we do have to educate our legislators about the facts about the injury compensation program and so forth. And we do have to do exactly what you're doing, Stephanie, take these bills apart and see where they work and don't work, and what they're trying to slide past us, what they say it does or doesn't do or will or won't do. Well, is that really what the wording says? And if not, hold these people accountable and get the truth out there. But wow, you know, it's easy to see little steps if you're looking at them out of context as not being a big deal.
Right. And as far as, you know, unvaccinated kids, you know, people are claiming that, you know, they're a threat to the community. Is that on par with how we used to treat students with active diseases like AIDS or HIV patients? I mean, could you speak to that at all?
There's a major point here, and that is the people who are supporting and actively promoting a pro-vaccine agenda, they equate vaccination status with immune status, but they aren't the same thing. Now, I'll perhaps be a little cynical when I say vaccination status is a marketing concern, but that's exactly what it is. The health issue is your immune status. And there's not a one-to-one correlation between vaccination and immunity. Not everybody who gets a vaccine gets immunity from the vaccine, assuming that you can even get immunity from a vaccine. That's a questionable point. Is vaccine theory sound, or how sound is it? But let's assume for purposes of this, we'll give them that one, that when there's the proper antibody response, we'll pretend for purposes of this point that means you are immune. Not everybody gets that antibody response, and it depends on the vaccine and the person. I've seen published studies or information on the CDC's website with efficacy rates of vaccines ranging from a claimed high of 99 to 100% in some situations. I'm skeptical of that, but let it be there for what it is for right now. But as low as negative 8%. There was an influenza study in Canada in 2015 that found that the influenza vaccine's effectiveness was negative 8%. You were more likely to get influenza if you got the vaccine.
Oh boy.
And so, here's the point. You can also have immune people, students in particular, children, you know, for purposes of this bill, who got natural immunity. You know, that rare condition that nobody's ever heard of anymore, but you can get natural immunity and without even developing symptoms. And this comes right off the CDC's website. So there are immune and not immune children in both vaccinated and unvaccinated populations.
Yeah.
So when you say, well, the unvaccinated people are a danger or a harm, well, let's look at the data here for a minute. You know, pertussis vaccine effectiveness is somewhere in around 80% or less, you know, and they claim hepatitis B is, I think, 95% effective, and the mumps was claimed to be 95% effective, but now there's this years-long ongoing court case about how that number was allegedly arrived at fraudulently, so the mumps vaccine probably isn't anywhere near 95% effective. And they claim high 90s for probably measles and chickenpox and so forth. But here's the bottom line. No vaccine is 100% effective. And statistically, looking at the medical literature, looking at statistics that states report about their immunization and exemption rates, we know that the number of non-immune vaccinated children is several times greater than the number of exempt children.
Yeah.
Now,
I think it's 10%, isn't it? Like around 10%. I think they say around 10% or something of the population, 8 to 10%, may not develop immunity. And about, in Ohio, it's about 3% of children that are out on exemptions. So you have more than 3 times as many kids that are probably not immune as are kids that are exempt. And yet we're the terrifying population that we are.
Those are probably, you know, generally speaking, good ballpark figures. But of course, it's going to vary from vaccine to vaccine. Some are more effective than others. And, be all over the board. But the bottom line is there are many more non-immune vaccinated kids than exempt kids. And the exempt kids, at least some of them, will have immunity from at least some of the diseases because they either contracted the illness or were exposed and developed immunity without getting symptoms at all. So if there's a concern medically, the far greater concern is with the far greater number of non-immune vaccinated kids. It's just a statistical reality. And if they're not concerned about them, and they don't need to be under the so-called herd immunity theory, there's a whole other topic of discussion that's been disproved over and over again, but they cling to it because it's really the only rationale for saying you have to get a vaccine because your vaccine protects other people. And if you don't get a vaccine, somehow that will magically make everybody else's vaccine stop working. And if you don't get a vaccine, it turns you into a galactic disease magnet where you will just instantly suck diseases from all corners of the galaxy and, kill yourself and everybody else around you. And I'm only being a little bit sarcastic here because that's in the direction of the attitude that we see from a lot of these people who are really aggressively pushing.
You're pretty close, actually, unfortunately.
Yeah, sadly, I'm not too far off the mark with that one. So the point here is that one of the things that I think may be helpful is for us to make sure our legislators understand that they are being co-opted as a taxpayer-funded marketing division of the pharmaceutical industry, that vaccination rates, trying to increase vaccination rates, get more vaccines for more children, and of course they're also opening up the adult market more and more as well too, that this is a marketing goal. And if we ever did have a point where we had maximized the effectiveness and benefit of vaccines, we've long since passed whatever that peak was, because now look at the injury and death rates, the injury and death reports, the dollars paid out. We've gone beyond, if there ever was, a peak benefit from vaccines into a horribly negative benefit on health grounds. So the vaccination status is a marketing issue. Immune status is the real and true health issue, and there are different ways to have immunity from the diseases and to be protected. And of course, getting the disease naturally or being exposed and not getting symptoms, but developing an immune response anyway, as many children and adults do. Homeoprophylaxis, of course, is among other options that are out there that are available that have been proven effective, that don't come with the risk of injury and death and don't come with the risk of unfairly profiting people in the pharmaceutical industry. Unfairly is a gross understatement because the people behind the agenda know that they are deliberately and unnecessarily killing and disabling growing numbers of children and adults now as they're opening up the adult markets in order to maximize profits. The big money in vaccines is not from the vaccines themselves, even though that's already in the $30-40 billion a year range internationally. The big money comes from the chronic diseases that vaccines create or exacerbate, because everyone who develops a chronic condition from a vaccine is a potential lifelong customer for other pharmaceutical products. We need to help our legislators understand these points, that they are being manipulated, they are being used to maximize profits to the net detriment of the health of our children in particular, but society as a whole.
Yeah, it's corporatism at its best, unfortunately.
Criminal corporatism.
Yeah. So, Alan, another thing that I'd like to kind of address is, they're making this an issue on parents' right to know what school exemption rates are. I know we're touching back on that again. But my question is, what about the right of parents to know that an Ohio exemption law exists? So they want the parents of immune-compromised children to have all these rights, to know all these things, and yet what about the basic right of all parents to even know that an exemption exists? I wish that was something that they'd want to address with a bill. Would you like to speak to that at all? I mean, as far as like educating parents on their exemption rights, do you know of any states that have a law that require that be made known to to the parents, or is that like pretty much unheard of? Because again, it would affect profits.
I've actually heard of one or two states that have laws requiring the state to notify parents of the availability of exemptions at any time that they're mentioning the mandates. And I was taken aback when I encountered that. I was recently digging around in the Idaho statutes for an attorney and client out there, and they actually have a law there that states that vaccines are not required. This is a little bit of a side issue, so I'll try to be brief. It's more than just semantics. You know, a lot of people say, well, there are exemptions, so they're not really required, and I respectfully disagree with that. No, they are required. The exemption is the second part.
Right.
They're required, but there are ways you can get out of it. And the reason I think it's more than just semantics is because if you start from, oh, they're not required, that implies that you don't have to do anything to be exempt. But there's no such thing as an exemption unless you start first with a requirement, and then you have to do something proactive. Even if you're talking about school exemptions in states where they have philosophical exemptions, so you don't have to qualify for medical or religious reasons, for example, so anybody can qualify. Yes, in common sense thinking, I can understand why somebody would say, well, that means effectively they're not required. But there's a technical point there that the starting place is, yes, they are required, and yes, you do have to do something proactive to exercise an exemption or to be exempt from the requirement. And I've gotten away now from whatever your initial point was, if you want to hear me back.
No, I was just kind of alluding to the fact that they want to have rights for the parents to know who's not vaccinated, and yet we don't have the right in Ohio to be informed that we have exemption rights available to us. So that's an issue. And then also, you know, they want to be informed of the ones that aren't vaccinated, but how about the shedding risk from vaccines? So that could be up to a 21-day shedding risk. I don't see schools running around saying, oh, we need to inform parents when children at school receive a live virus vaccine because they may shed to, they're just as dangerous to an immune compromised student as an unvaccinated child, if actually more so if they're actually possibly shedding the illness, whereas the unvaccinated child maybe hasn't even been exposed, they're not carrying the disease, they're not a disease vector, but the shedding child would be a possible vector for the immune compromised kids. And again, that's not addressed either. I guess I'm expressing a frustration more than a question there, which I'm sure you would agree that that doesn't make any sense. It doesn't add up. As far as what the bill sponsors are claiming, they did specifically say that the tracking would help the schools respond better in an outbreak. But currently, they already handle outbreaks by the exemption forms. I mean, as far as every exemption form I've ever seen from any parent in the state, it always says your child may be excluded for up to 21 days or the duration of the outbreak or something to that effect. So when there's an outbreak, the first thing the schools do is go pull the kids that have exemptions, and then they send them home. So why do we need a law to track students that are unvaccinated? We already have that. It's called an exemption form. Check the child's file, get the form out, send the child home. So to me, that doesn't make any sense. I don't know, could you speak to any reason why they're further tracking of that when you already have the form? It seems redundant to make a law to track something that you already have a policy in effect for.
Well, yes, and every time you see something that doesn't pass the sniff test, or that you've got a real clear reason to say it doesn't make sense, this all goes back to the comment I made earlier that we've got to make a distinction between what's genuinely vaccine marketing as opposed to really a genuine health concern. We've got to learn to make those distinctions, and not only just to argue that it does or doesn't make sense, but to point out what's behind that. When parents get up in front of legislators and try to make health points, a hired medical doctor will get up there and shoot them all down, and he or she's the authority, and they'll take the doctor's word for it or the health department person's word for it, and all our efforts and common sense and research goes out the window, or certainly there's a risk of that. So we have to help them understand that we have legitimate points. And again, this is just a strategy question. not necessarily a suggestion, because we're all in uncharted territory here. So we have to experiment, see what works, what doesn't work. So this is just a suggestion then to consider framing some of these issues as marketing versus health, and try to help our legislators see what's really going on in that respect. But again, it's all part of an agenda that's been unfolding for decades, and these are just the latest steps. It doesn't make any sense medically and therefore legally, because our healthcare policy and law, as a general proposition, tracks mainstream medicine. And so, nobody has a legal right to put their children at serious risk of harm. Sort of by definition, it would be illegal if you're putting your child at risk of harm, for example. So this whole proposition that, when there's an outbreak, we got to send all the unvaccinated kids home. Well, remember the much larger group of non-immune vaccinated children we talked about a few minutes ago? None of them have to stay home.
Right.
And
the health department needs to send all the children home. Then you don't even need to check forms. There's an outbreak, everybody go home because you might have been exposed.
The point is that policy serves a marketing agenda. It does not serve a health agenda. And we need to help our legislators understand that. And when you send, for example, children whose parents have a religious exemption home, and you're not sending home the other children who are lacking immunity, and again, for this point, we'll presume that not having a vaccine, you lack immunity unless you've actually done testing to show that you have immunity despite not having gotten the vaccine. So we'll play it safe, again, for purposes of this point. Okay, you're not vaccinated. We'll presume, benefit of the doubt here, that you're lacking immunity. Well, there's lots of other kids who have been vaccinated who also lack immunity. Their vaccine immunity has worn off, which it does over time in many people, or they never got immunity from the vaccine in the first place. None of them have to stay home. That sounds like religious discrimination to me. And I think there's a strong case to be made for that. I wouldn't take it to court, though, because you'd be asking a judge to overturn policy that's been around throughout the country for a few decades now. And I wouldn't want to be the judge who was the first one to, well, I would, but most people wouldn't want to be the first judge to turn that over in a courtroom, and it would probably lose on appeal anyway. It should win in the courtroom and on appeal. But judges are human beings, and I see in the real world sometimes they don't like to leave children unvaccinated. They don't want to be responsible for some child dying from measles or whatever, and the law be damned. And pardon my language, but that sometimes is the attitude that comes across. Of course, they don't ever speak those words. Yeah. It's difficult, though, in a world where we're all psychologically manipulated. We're all given propaganda that is expert propaganda. There's no shame in being fooled, but we need to come to grips and terms with the fact that we have been fooled and learn how to step out of that, which of course is what we're all about here today. So many judges, of course, and people in other fields, but for purposes of lawsuits, many judges are steeped in the mainstream view, and it's a very powerful view, so powerful that some of them feel compelled to step over the law to get a result that their manipulated and ultimately misleading or false point of view drives them to do. So these are difficult issues, and I think most of the time for this reason, vaccine issues are probably better dealt with legislatively.
Yeah, and one of the sponsors said at the hearing that, or made the statement at the hearing that I think, in other states where they have this, vaccine education, I'm backtracking a little bit here, but where they have the vaccine education, they said that the vaccine rates went up about 35%, right? So, I mean, again, it's marketing, it's bullying the parents, and then stating, we won't bully the parents. Again, none of that's in the bill. So, I guess maybe my final question for you would be, how do you counter effectively when legislators are stating something that is not in black and white in the bill?
You just, as politely and concisely as you can say, just say, that's not what the bill says.
Yeah, well, that's the hard reality.
That's not what it says.
That's not what it says. Do you want, if you'd like to put that in there and then read me the new bill you guys have written up, that'd be fine. We'll hear it then. I really appreciate you taking time to do this. I know you're very, very busy guy. I encourage everybody that's watching this, if you haven't read the bill, take a look at it. Go to our website and you can sign a legislator letter, which will be sent directly to your legislator that's in opposition to HB559. So you can do that. Follow our Facebook page. We have information, also an idea of what you can call your legislators about. We have the health committee, all of the names and phone numbers listed there, so you can call to oppose this bill. And again, you can fill out the form online. So I hope that everybody watching this will do that. And as we can, we will continue to bring you updates on the bill, where it is, when opponent testimony happens, that kind of thing. We're staying on top of this bill because we do not want this bill passing in Ohio. So we have to come out in droves. Anyone that can go and provide opponent testimony or be at the hearings, I encourage them to do so. And also take Alan's advice and talk to your legislators. And again, when they give you this nonsense of, oh, well, that's not our intent, or this is what we're going to do, again, just reiterate to them, that's not what the bill says. I think we need a hashtag for that. That's not what the bill says. Anyway, Alan, thank you so much. I appreciate your time. I hope you have a great night. And thank you, everybody, for watching.